Jacob's hand was like a vice on my shoulder as he pushed me toward the door, his voice cold, calculating. "Remember, Megan," he said, the words cutting through the thick air between us. "This is for us, for our survival." His words had become a mantra, a broken record that echoed in my mind every time he forced me out the door. But there was no us anymore. There was only him, the man who owned me, body and soul. And every time he said survival, I felt more like a prisoner than a partner. I stepped into the night, the cool breeze doing nothing to ease the heat rising inside me. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to be the woman he'd turned me into. But what choice did I have? Jacob had made sure there was no way out. He had created a life where I was trapped, stuck in a world I couldn't escape from, no matter how much I tried to claw my way out. I remembered the first time he suggested I sleep with other men. I had thought it was a sick joke, something he'd say to test me. But when I hesitated, when I asked why, he told me it was for survival. "We need the money, Megan. This is the only way we're going to make it. You'll do this for us, won't you?" The word us had never felt so empty. I wanted to scream, to run, to walk out the door and never look back. But the fear in my chest, the fear of losing everything I had, even the little bit Jacob had given me, held me in place. I had told myself I could handle it. I told myself it was just one night, one man. But it never stopped there. The men changed, but the story was always the same. Jacob would book the appointments, always keeping a tight grip on the money. "Time is money," he'd say, as though I were nothing but a commodity, an item to be rented out for a few hours in exchange for cash. With each new man, I felt like I was losing a little bit of myself. The first man had been gentle, kind, but it didn't matter. In the end, I was still just another transaction. I didn't matter to them, not really. When I tried to resist, Jacob's anger flared up. This is for us, Megan. This is how we survive. Don't make me say it again," he'd warn. And so I went along with it. I didn't have a choice. I'd be lying if I said it didn't break something inside me each time. The first time I let go of my pride and allowed myself to be touched by a stranger, I felt like I was dying inside. My body was there, but my soul wasn't. It wasn't a part of the exchange. It never was. But I couldn't stop, because if I did, if I fought back, if I said no, I knew what would happen. I knew he'd throw me out just like he had before. And that thought, the fear of being alone again with nowhere to go, terrified me more than anything. So I kept going. I kept doing it for him, for survival. I told myself it was for survival. But the truth was so much worse. Jacob didn't care about me. He never had. He was using me, using my body to line his pockets and feed his selfish desires, while I was left to pick up the shattered pieces of a life I no longer recognized. As I stepped into the car, I felt hollow. Every time I did this, it felt like another piece of me was being chipped away, leaving me less and less of the woman I used to be. But still, I kept going. I kept doing it, because deep down, I feared the alternative might be even worse. This wasn't survival. It was a slow death. The car's engine roared to life, pulling me deeper into the night. I stared out the window, but the world outside was nothing more than a blur. The lights of the city, the faces passing by, they didn't mean anything anymore. I wasn't part of that world. I was just a passenger, drifting through life, an object to be discarded when no longer useful. I tried to quiet the voices in my head, the ones calling me weak, telling me I was nothing more than a tool for survival. "It's just one more night," I whispered to myself, "just one more, for survival." But the words felt like ash in my mouth. I didn't recognize myself anymore. The girl who had once dreamed of love, safety, and hope, she was gone. In her place was a hollow shell, someone who followed orders and played the part of a wife, even though nothing about it felt real. The first time I slept with a man for money, I cried the entire night afterward. I didn't even care if Jacob saw or heard me. But now I couldn't cry anymore, not for myself, not for the life I was trapped in. There were no tears left, only an emptiness that grew with every transaction, every man, every night I spent pretending I was still the person I used to be. And yet, despite everything, something inside me still flickered. It was barely a spark, a dying ember, but it was there. I had no idea that, on this particular night, it would be enough to change everything. I stepped into the hotel room like I had so many times before, the air heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and stale whiskey. The man was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone without a care in the world. It was always the same, a cold, impersonal dance. His eyes didn't hold any real interest. To him, I wasn't a person, I was just a transaction. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice flat, like I was just another chore on his to-do list. I tried to suppress the anger flaring inside me. I didn't want to feel it. I didn't want to feel anything. But it was there, bubbling under the surface, and for once, I didn't push it down. As I began to undress, the weight of everything I had become pressed down on me. He reached for the strap of my dress, his movements mechanical, detached. I stood there, frozen, willing myself to feel nothing. But as his fingers brushed against my shoulder, something inside me cracked. Before I could stop it, a tear slid down my cheek, hot and unrelenting. Then another, and another. "Are you crying?" he asked, his voice sharp with surprise. He stopped immediately, his hand hovering in midair, uncertain. I shook my head quickly, wiping at my face with trembling fingers. No, I'm fine," I lied, my voice cracking under the weight of the untruth. "It's nothing. Just forget it." "Nothing?" he repeated, his tone softening now, more curious than accusatory. "You're crying, and you're saying it's nothing?" I swallowed hard, straightened my shoulders, and forced myself to sound convincing. "I'm here for business, okay? Don't mind the tears. Let's just do this so I can go home." The word home tasted bitter on my tongue, a place that hadn't felt like home in years. But he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he stepped back, shaking his head. "No," he said firmly. "Not like this. I can't." My breath caught in my throat, panic flaring in my chest. "What do you mean? Look, I'm fine. Let's just..." I said no. His voice was calm but resolute. He grabbed my dress from where it had slipped and carefully placed it back on my shoulders, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Whatever's going on with you, I can't. I won't. Not when you're like this." I felt my defenses rising, the familiar urge to push through, to suppress. "It doesn't matter," I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. "You don't need to care. Just take what you paid for and be done with it." He ignored me. Instead, he walked to the corner of the room, opened the minibar, and pulled out a small bottle of whiskey. He poured it into a glass and handed it to me. "Here, drink this. Sit down. Sit." "I don't need." "Sit." His tone left no room for argument. I hesitated, but eventually sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the glass like a lifeline. The silence between us was heavy, almost suffocating. "You don't have to tell me anything," he began, his voice softer now. "But whatever this is, it's not just about tonight. You're carrying something." I stared at the glass, refusing to meet his gaze. "You don't know anything about me." "No, I don't," he admitted, "but I know pain when I see it." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was wrong, that he didn't understand, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was too heavy, too close to the surface. He sighed and leaned back against the dresser, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Fine. You don't want to talk, I get it. I won't press you. But maybe if I tell you something about me, it'll make this less awkward." I glanced up at him, surprised. No one ever cared to share anything real with me in these situations. It was all transactional, detached. "My name's Adrian," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes serious. "I'm a businessman, successful, I guess, at least on paper. But I'm not here because I wanted to be. I'm here because I walked in on my best friend screwing my wife." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I forgot my own misery, my own tangled web of lies and pain. "She didn't even try to deny it," he continued, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Didn't apologize. Just packed her things and left. I didn't know what to do with myself. So here I am, trying to clear my head in the worst way possible." I didn't know what to say. His honesty caught me off guard, and for a fleeting moment, I felt an odd sense of connection. Like maybe in some twisted way we weren't so different. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He gave a small, bitter laugh. "Don't be. I'm the one who should be apologizing. I brought you here, thinking it would fix something. But it won't. Not like this." He stood and walked toward the door. Pulling out his wallet, he handed me the agreed-upon amount, then added a few extra bills. Take it. And if you ever need help, real help, call me." He slid a card into my hand. His name and number were printed in elegant black script. I stared at it, confused and overwhelmed. Why are you doing this? Because no one should feel the way you do right now, he said simply. And with that, he walked out, leaving me alone in the room with a drink in my hand, tears on my face, and a tiny spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Jacob's demands became relentless, an endless cycle that turned my days into a haze of dread and emptiness. Every morning, he handed me a list of men, complete with instructions and expectations. He never asked how I felt about it. To him, my feelings were irrelevant. This is how we survive, Megan, he'd say, his tone icy and dismissive. Do you think the rent pays itself? Or the groceries magically appear on the table? I didn't have the strength to argue most days. It was easier to comply, to go through the motions like a puppet on strings, but the weight of it was crushing. Each encounter left me feeling less like a person and more like a shadow of someone I used to be. One evening, as I was dressing for yet another client, I couldn't take it anymore. My hands shook as I zipped up the red dress Jacob had picked out, a dress I hated because it wasn't mine, because it was never meant to be me. I turned to him, my voice trembling but resolute. Jacob, I can't do this tonight, I said, clutching the back of a chair for support. He looked up from his phone, his face twisting into a mask of disbelief and irritation. What do you mean you can't do this? Of course you can! The car's already waiting. No, I said, louder this time, though my voice still quivered. I'm tired. I'm done with this, Jacob. I can't keep... Before I could finish, he was on his feet, his fists slamming against the table. The sound echoed through the small apartment, silencing me. You're tired? He spat, his voice venomous. Tired of what, Megan? Having a roof over your head, eating food you didn't earn? You think you get to complain? His words stung, but I held my ground, even as tears welled up in my eyes. This isn't survival, Jacob. This is hell. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Hell? You think you're in hell now? Keep talking like that, and I'll show you what real hell looks like. Jacob's anger had become a storm I could no longer weather. Every word he hurled at me struck like lightning, scolding and unrelenting. Do you think this house pays for itself? He snarled, his face red with fury. You think food magically appears on the table? This is how we survive, Megan. This is how you survive. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I wanted to scream that this wasn't survival, that this wasn't living, but I couldn't. My voice, my strength, he had stolen them long ago. When I tried to protest, to say that I couldn't go through with yet another night of losing myself to strangers, he exploded. His voice echoed through the small apartment, venom dripping from every syllable. You're worthless, he spat. A good-for-nothing leech who can't even pull her weight. I tried to hold my ground, shaking my head, tears welling up in my eyes. I can't keep doing this, Jacob. I'm breaking. Breaking? He roared, advancing on me. You want to talk about breaking? You'll break, all right. Out there on the streets, where you belong. Before I could comprehend what was happening, he stormed into our bedroom, flung open the closet, and yanked my clothes from their hangers. One by one, they flew into a battered suitcase. His movements were wild, erratic, as if he couldn't bear the sight of me any longer. You don't want to work? Fine, he said, shoving the suitcase into my hands. His voice was cold now, almost calm. Get out! You're not my problem anymore. Jacob, please, I whispered, my voice trembling. I have nowhere to go. He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that churned my stomach. Not my concern. Let the streets take you in. Or better yet, maybe one of your clients will. But don't come back here. You're done. With that, he shoved me toward the door, his hands rough and unfeeling. I stumbled, clutching the suitcase as if it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening finality, the sound reverberating in my chest like a gunshot. And just like that, I was alone. The night was cold, the kind of chill that sank into your bones and made you feel like you'd never be warm again. The streets were eerily quiet, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows that danced ominously against the pavement. I wandered aimlessly, my feet dragging, my body numb. The suitcase felt heavier with every step, as if it carried not just my belongings, but every mistake I'd ever made. Jacob's parting words rang in my ears like a cruel mantra. No one will want you. You're nothing. You're nothing. I found a bench beneath a flickering street lamp and collapsed onto it, clutching the suitcase to my chest. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry, not the silent tears I had mastered to avoid Jacob's wrath, but deep, guttural sobs that racked my entire body. How did it come to this? I whispered into the night. I stared at the wedding ring still clinging to my finger, its once bright luster now dull and lifeless. It was supposed to symbolize love, commitment, a future, but all it had ever brought me was pain, shame, and a life I could barely recognize as my own. For hours, I sat there, lost in the labyrinth of my thoughts, homeless, broken, worthless. At least that's what Jacob had convinced me to believe. And yet, deep down, a small voice whispered a truth I wasn't ready to face just yet. I had always been more than what he made me. I just didn't know how to find her again. The first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my coat, shivering against the morning chill. I didn't know where I was going or how I would survive, but I knew one thing: I couldn't go back. With trembling hands, I opened the suitcase to find something warm to wear. As I did, Adrian's card slipped out from the folds of a blouse. I stared at it for a long moment, his words from that night echoing in my mind. If you ever need help, real help, call me. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want pity. But maybe, just maybe, Adrian had seen something in me worth saving, something I had forgotten existed. I slipped the card into my pocket, unsure if I would ever use it. But for the first time in what felt like forever, the possibility of hope glimmered on the horizon. The night crept in like an unwelcome visitor, and the cold bit at my skin through my thin coat. My suitcase rested by my feet as I sat huddled on the same bench where I'd spent the last few hours, the city buzzing with life around me, yet I felt utterly invisible. A few people glanced at me as they passed, but no one stopped. No one asked. As the chill deepened, so did my desperation. The thought of sleeping on this bench terrified me. I had no phone, no money, and no one to turn to. But then, my fingers brushed against the card in my pocket again. Adrian. He said I could call him if I needed help. But how? My eyes scanned the street until they landed on a small convenience store glowing under a flickering neon sign. People streamed in and out, their phones clutched in their hands. I swallowed my pride and walked up to a woman in her late 40s, her face kind but tired. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but could I borrow your phone for a moment? It's an emergency." She hesitated, her eyes scanning me, clearly debating whether I was trustworthy, but then she sighed and handed it to me. "Make it quick." I fumbled with the card, my hands trembling as I dialed Adrian's number. The phone rang twice before his deep, familiar voice answered, calm but curious. "Hello?" "It's Megan," I said, my voice cracking. I didn't know who else to call." There was a pause, then a shift in his tone, softer, concerned. "Megan? Where are you?" "On a street bench," I admitted, the shame cutting through me like a blade. Jacob threw me out. I have nowhere to go." "I'm coming to get you," he said without hesitation. "Stay where you are." Before I could even thank him, the line went dead. I handed the phone back to the woman with a quiet "thank you" and returned to my bench, my heart pounding. Within 20 minutes, a sleek black car pulled up in front of me and Adrian stepped out, his face etched with concern. He walked toward me, his coat billowing slightly in the wind. "You look like you haven't slept in days," he said softly, his eyes scanning me. "Let's get you out of here." He didn't ask many questions then, just opened the car door and helped me inside. The warmth of the car was a stark contrast to the icy street, and for the first time in hours, I felt a small measure of relief. He drove us to a quiet hotel on the edge of the city, the kind that was modest but clean, with soft lighting and a receptionist who barely looked up as he checked me in. Adrian paid for the room without a second thought and walked me to the door. Once inside, he turned to face me. "Megan, I need to know what happened. Why are you out here like this?" I hesitated, sitting on the edge of the bed as I tried to piece my words together. It's a long story," I said, tears already welling up in my eyes. "I've got time," he replied, pulling a chair closer. "Start from the beginning." So I did. I told him everything. The marriage that had started with promises of love but quickly turned into something else entirely. The clients Jacob sent me to, the manipulation, the degradation, the nights I cried myself to sleep, and today he threw me out like I was nothing. Adrian didn't interrupt, but his expression darkened as I spoke, his jaw tightening. When I finally finished, my voice hoarse and my chest heaving with sobs, he reached out and placed a hand on mine. "Megan, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "No one deserves what you've been through." I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of his empathy felt almost foreign after years of being dismissed and used. He stood after a moment, his movements deliberate and calm. "You're safe here," he said. "Stay as long as you need to figure out your next steps. I'll check on you tomorrow." True to his word, Adrian left me alone in that room, giving me the space I hadn't known I needed. Over the next few weeks, he made sure the hotel was paid for and even had meals sent up to my room. But he never pressured me, never hovered. Finally, during one of his visits, he asked gently, "What do you want to do now, Megan? What kind of life do you want to build from here?" The question hit me hard. I had spent so long surviving that I had forgotten what it felt like to dream of something better. But for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder, could I start over? Could I finally reclaim my life? With Adrian's support, I started piecing my life back together. He didn't push or control me, he just encouraged me, gave me the tools to find my footing, and let me decide what to do with them. I used some of the money I had managed to save, along with a generous loan from him, to open a small boutique. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was mine. At first, I was terrified. The voices from my past haunted me, especially Jacob's. "You're nothing without me," he'd sneer in my mind, but I refused to let his lies win. Slowly but surely, I began to believe in myself. The boutique grew and people started to notice me for something other than what I'd been forced to do. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a purpose. And then there was Adrian. What started as gratitude and friendship grew into something much deeper. I tried to fight it at first. I'd built so many walls around my heart, I wasn't sure I even knew how to let someone in. But Adrian was patient. He saw me in ways no one else ever had, and eventually, I couldn't deny the connection between us. One quiet evening, after dinner at his apartment, we were laughing about something silly when the laughter faded into a silence that felt different, comfortable, intense. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his touch sending shivers down my spine. "You've been through so much," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You deserve to be happy, Megan, truly happy." I barely had time to process his words before his lips met mine. It wasn't rushed or demanding, it was gentle, careful, filled with a kind of love I'd never known. That night, as we made love, he broke down walls I hadn't even realized I'd built. For the first time, I felt seen, cherished, whole. As the weeks passed, my life became something I'd never thought possible, peaceful, joyful, and full of purpose. The boutique flourished, and with Adrian by my side, I started to feel like the world wasn't such a cruel place after all. But the past doesn't let go easily, and one day, word of Jacob's downfall reached me. Without me, everything had unraveled for him. The clients, the connections, the manipulations, it was all gone. He was drowning in debt, abandoned by the very people he'd prioritized over me. I don't know what made me decide to confront him. Closure, maybe? Or maybe I just needed to see for myself that he no longer had any power over me. I found him in a dingy bar, hunched over a glass of whiskey. He looked terrible, unshaven, disheveled, a shell of the man I once knew. When he saw me, his eyes narrowed and he forced a weak smirk. "Well, look who it is," he said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Come to gloat?" I didn't flinch. I stood tall, my voice steady. "No, Jacob, I came to remind you that you don't own me anymore. You never did." He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "And what? You think you're better than me now?" "Yes," I said, my tone firm, because I chose to rebuild my life instead of destroying someone else's. He didn't say anything after that. He just stared at me, and for the first time, I thought I saw something like regret in his eyes. But I didn't stick around to analyze it. I turned and walked out, leaving him, and that chapter of my life behind for good. When I got back to the boutique later that evening, Adrian was waiting for me with a bouquet of flowers. He pulled me into his arms, holding me close. "How does it feel to finally leave it all behind?" he whispered. I looked up at him, my heart full, my eyes brimming with tears, not of sadness, but of hope. It feels like a new beginning, I said, and for the first time, I truly believed it. Adrian and I started dating officially not long after that night. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, it was something better, steady, genuine, and full of the kind of love I had only dreamed of before. He treated me like I was the most precious thing in his world, not as someone to use or manipulate, but as a partner, an equal. Every day with him was a lesson in what love should feel like. He remembered the little things, how I liked my coffee, the way I hummed a song when I was nervous, even the stories I told about the future I wanted, but never thought I could have. He'd surprise me with thoughtful gestures, like leaving notes in my boutique or showing up unannounced with my favorite pastries. But it wasn't just the sweet moments. Adrian was there for the hard times too, the nightmares I still had, the insecurities that crept in when I least expected them. He never brushed them off or made me feel like a burden. Instead, he held me through them, reminding me that I was stronger than the ghosts of my past. One evening, after closing the boutique, Adrian insisted on taking me out for dinner. He said it was just to celebrate how well the business was doing. But there was something in his smile, a glint of excitement he couldn't quite hide. We drove to a quiet cliffside restaurant overlooking the city lights. The setting was magical, with soft music playing in the background and candles flickering on every table. As dessert arrived, he took my hand, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart race. "Megan," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you've been through so much, and yet here you are, stronger, more incredible than ever. You've taught me that love isn't about fixing someone, it's about growing together, about choosing each other every day, and there's no one else I want to choose for the rest of my life." Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal the most beautiful ring I'd ever seen. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Tears streamed down my face as I nodded, unable to speak at first. "Yes," I finally managed, laughing through the tears. 1,000 times, yes. The entire restaurant erupted in applause, but in that moment it felt like it was just the two of us. Adrian slid the ring onto my finger, and it fit perfectly, just like us. Our wedding was a small, intimate affair, surrounded by the people who had supported us along the way. As I walked down the aisle toward Adrian, I felt like I was stepping into a life I'd never thought possible, a life filled with love, respect, and hope. And as we exchanged vows, I realized something profound. My past didn't define me, it shaped me. It led me to this moment, to this man, to this happiness I had finally found. We lived a life full of love, laughter, and partnership. Adrian never stopped treating me like a queen, and I never stopped being grateful for the second chance I'd been given. Together, we built a life that proved even the darkest chapters can lead to the brightest endings.